Line now. Nick in Richmond. Morning to you, Nick.
Good morning. I was going to dovetail into your conversations about the police and Trump with the common denominator of Marxist cultural revolution. That sounds a bit of a mouthful to a lot of people. It used to be openly talked about in the 60s and 70s, and people like Herbert Marcuse used to be on TV talking about, pre-revolution standards, but it kind of morphed into critical race theory, gender studies, and postmodernism. A lot of those sort of people went into the BBC.
Did you just say postmodernism?
Sorry?
Did you just say postmodernism?
I did, yes.
So you've mentioned Marxism and postmodernism.
I have,
Can you give us a 10-second summary of Kant and what he stood for, please? Your time starts
now. A 10-second summary of...
Kant.
I'm more into Nietzsche and Hegel. It's about theory of reason, Kant, but, I probably wouldn't be able to do it justice. But
Nietzsche sounds like some sort of fruit, like a lychee. OK, give us 10 seconds on Nietzsche.
Basically saying that God is dead and man has taken over moral responsibility for the world, and therefore man needs to take the place of God and make the decision making. But
hang on, steady on. Let's go a bit more slowly. So, what about Descartes? Sum up Descartes in 10 seconds.
Descartes says that. It's basically about proving the existence of God, First Meditations of Philosophy, proving the existence of God and saying that man has a spirit, and basically that through your existential experience, you can actually individually understand that you have a spirit. But I wanted to actually
what about
go on
Aristotle?
to Marxist Cultural Revolution.
OK, before we go on to the Marxist Cultural Revolution, what about Aristotle?
Aristotle was quite much into categorizing things. Around the time of Plato, they were quite similar in terms of their views. Aristotle formed the categories of categorizing things in academia, like animals or other things, and also talked about a theory of forms to some extent.
Archimedes?
The king's crown in the bath understood density by seeing how much the water rose in the bath. But we're on a bit of a sidetrack here.
What did he say? What did he say, Archimedes, when he made this discovery?
He said, "Eureka."
Indeed he did. OK, you passed the test. Let's move on. Back to cultural Marxism.
Yeah, so in the 60s and 70s, people like Herbert Marcuse were on the TV talking about, Marxism and the need for revolution. Of course, I was saying that's all gone into critical race theory, gender studies, etc. BBC, let's go back onto the real track. The BBC have been trying to delegitimize the police for a whole generation now.
Have they?
Yes, the Stephen Lawrence...
For somebody who seems to know quite a bit about philosophy, it's disappointing to see that you turn out to be a conspiracy theorist.
No, I'm not talking about conspiracy theory. I'm talking about facts that I see with my own eyes.
Facts? You're going to say it's a fact that the BBC wants to delegitimize the BBC
for a whole generation. With for example, with Stephen Lawrence panning that out for a whole generation, pretty much.
I'm very disappointed. All of that education, whether it's self-education or you've been taught it, has gone to waste.
Well, you might think so, but let's go on to the United States and Trump. This cultural warfare, Black Lives Matter, it is a Marxist revolutionary organization. They've self-admitted that. The people in that organization are trying to attack the symbols of the culture, the statues, the police. They are often sort of deranged mob mentality figures that shout fascist, racist,
The BBC is the mob, is it?
Sorry?
The BBC is the mob. They're fascists.
No, I'm talking now about Black Lives Matter in the United States.
What's the BBC got to do with that? And why have you called to have a go at the BBC? I don't understand.
They've cultivated it. They have cultivated all of these organisations talking constantly about oppression, racism, genderism.
Well, the BBC talks about a lot of things because the BBC has a news arm and it reports on the news.
Yes, but they have a bias in favour of this interpretation of the world as an oppressive structure.
Do they?
Yes, they do. They have a bias.
Are you sure you're not looking at the BBC through your own lens? Because you do realise that the BBC gets accused of bias for people from diametrically opposite sides. So take Israel-Palestine. You'll get people who are very supportive of the Israel side who will be accusing the BBC of bias, and people who are supportive of the Palestinian side.
Well, the number one paper read at the BBC is The Guardian.
Is it? How do you know that?
There's a statistic on that.
Is there?
Somebody did a Freedom of Information request, and the number one
How would they know
newspaper
that from a Freedom of Information request?
Sorry?
How would they know that from a Freedom of Information request? I was
Because
at the BBC. I was at the
it's the number
BBC
one
for
paper
9 years. I
purchased.
can't remember being asked once which papers I read. And
No,
by
but
the way,
it's the number of
I read a
papers-
range of papers.
The number of papers purchased by the BBC for their internal use. The Guardian is the number one.
When I was at the BBC seemed to live in fear of the Daily Mail. There was a sort of informal Daily Mail test. Let's make sure that we don't fall foul of the Daily Mail. So Nick, I just don't think you know what you're talking about. Did you work at the BBC?
No, I've never worked at the BBC.
Why
Anyway,
are you putting the degree of knowledge that you have of philosophy and so forth to such poor use by going after the BBC?
I've noticed a bias in favour of what Jordan Peterson calls postmodern neo-Marxism.
Peterson, please save me.
Sorry?
You're not one of those people who sits in cupboards and listens to Jordan Peterson, are you?
I don't sit in cupboards and listen to him, but I have listened to a number of his lectures. Yes.
On YouTube.
On YouTube or otherwise, yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Should we leave it there, or do you want to have the final word?
Well, I wanted to say that what Trump is talking about is opposing this Marxist cultural revolution that's ripping down our statues. You can be in denial of it. Of course, you can be in denial that it's happening. I suspect most media figures are in denial of it.
We're very left-wing, aren't we, the British media? Sunday Times, Sunday Telegraph, Telegraph Times, Sun, Daily Mail, Daily Express, Sunday Mail, Sunday Express. Lefty cranko newspapers, right?
Well, there is a spectrum of opinion, but I would say in today's world, the spectrum of opinion is tilted towards the left.
Yeah, I'd say you're
common theme.
I'd say you're wrong about that, Nick. Tell me, what is it that you think justifies having a statue of a slaver in a city centre? Because
if it wasn't for the progression of events that led to our culture today, if it wasn't for all the phases we went through, the Enlightenment, democracy, etc., we wouldn't be having this conversation. So we could be talking about, with the Colosseum, they had terrible things that they did there, made people fight to the death. Let's rip it all down. It's nonsensical. If you use a Hegelian point of view, history is an evolutionary process that always changes. Why do we need to be communists and say we're going to start a year zero now? Every 50 years we need a year zero and erase history. If you're going to bring Hegel, a German, into it, I'm going to bring another German into it. Do you think that Germany should have statues of Hitler or Himmler or Goebbels in Berlin, for example? Do you think a good idea or bad idea? Would you take them down? It could be done for a historical perspective,
but it's not done, is it? It's not done, is it?
Not from a
because it'd be deeply offensive, wouldn't it, to have a statue of Hitler in the middle of Berlin? So you can understand,
maybe in a museum,
right? So why don't you think, for example, Edward Colston belongs in a museum rather than the middle of Bristol? I mean, this is a guy who enslaved 80,000, 100,000 people. Well, that's a debate that could be had in a council. No, I want to know what you think. What do you think? I think I don't want a mob ripping it down. No, fine. I think I agree with that. But do you think he should be there? I think you could argue it both ways. No, which way would you argue it? I don't think you should erase history, and I think you should understand your culture. And so, do we need Hitler statues as well? Then should we have Hitler? Should we have Hitler statues to understand that we beat Hitler in a war? You could do. Do you understand the difference between having a? Do you understand the point of view? Do you understand as opposed to trying to self-gratify from the statue? Okay. It would be a purely historical. Do you, Nick, understand the difference between learning about history in a textbook or in a museum and venerating figures from the past by having them made statues of? At the end of the day, they could put a plaque on these statues, giving some context to satisfy people who think that the statues are there glorifying something that they don't like. They could just put a plaque on them. Yeah, but they are glorifying something that they don't like. They're glorifying someone who enslaved people. Yeah, but that's what happened in the past. But you don't glorify them in 2020, do you, Nick? That's the point. Well, then why don't they go to knock down Aztec ruins because they had slavery? Why don't they go knock down the pyramids? Because the Egyptians had slavery. You know why? Because we go back to Marxist cultural revolution. Shall I argue that? The pyramids, I've seen the pyramids. I mean, I think they're 7,000 years old, aren't they?
I'm not sure, but very old, yeah.
Very old, right, okay. But Edward Colston, he was operating, wasn't he, I think in the 19th century or the 18th century? I mean, that's
the Incas and the Aztecs were operating 500 years ago. They had slavery.
It's a little more distant.
It's
a little more distant. When I was in Latin America, and I worked out this week, actually, I was feeling very nostalgic, as I was saying on the show yesterday. I travelled around 8 countries in Latin America in 1999. In 8.5 weeks, I spent 850 quid. It was quite good, apart from the international airfare in and out of the continent. Anyway, those were the days. Well, I was acutely aware back then of the suffering that those beautiful churches had been built on the back of. But, and this is important, but, if you look at the pyramids, there are unlikely to be people today who look at the pyramids and feel bad about it. If you're a person of colour, or indeed if you're a self-respecting white person, and you pass a slaver and you're aware that that person was a slaver, you might very well feel upset and uncomfortable with it. There's a difference between you're taking it to an extreme by saying that we should knock down the pyramids. I know you don't think we should, but by using that as an example, it's not a fair or accurate example.
Well, I would say I've never heard a black person mention to me they walk by a statue and feel terrible. I've only heard middle-class liberals really say that, and I think that's pretty much the reality.
All right, well, you may be right on that. Nick, thank you. That's Nick in Richmond. We'll go to Alex in Leeds.